Big week. A lot of things happening, as you know, folks, and I'm honored to have back with me someone I consider a dear friend and someone who provides incredible insight. He was actually the first guest I had on this radio show almost 10 years ago, Paul Rosenberg. And when Paul came on, he spoke about how the government and the intelligence agencies were surveilling every American's phone calls, internet activities, financial transactions, text messages. And the feedback that came to our general manager, Linda Hughes, at the time was, well, this is an interesting show, kind of conspiracy theory. But in that first guest Janda had on, Paul Rosen seems like a really good guy, very intelligent, incredible background in information technology. But, well, he talked about every American's being surveilled. Well, those who listened to that show 10 years ago were about 9 3/4 years ahead of the rest of the crowd. And that's what we do with this show, and that's what we do with our analysts who come on this show, who have the courage to present information that the deep state does not want you to know about. A little background on Paul. Paul Rosenberg is an adventure capitalist with a broad range of interests and experiences under his belt. Current passions include philosophy, theology, history, psychology, and physics. Previous to his current activities, Paul developed a highly successful engineering career, which resulted in him being recruited as a consultant to a number of high-profile organizations, such as NASA and the United States military. He has developed and taught 19 courses for Iowa State University, the College of Engineering, and he also co-founded the Fiber Optic Association. He is a cybersecurity expert extraordinaire, founder of a phenomenal website with phenomenal content, freemansperspective.com. Paul, welcome back to Operation Freedom.
Oh, thank you, Dave. Always a pleasure.
Paul, educate our listeners. You are also, you wear many hats, true Renaissance man. You are also the CEO of a fantastic company, a company that has kept the Janda family safe for years, that being Crypto Hippie, and have protected us on the internet. Educate our listeners on Crypto Hippie and how it can benefit each and every one of them.
Oh, sure. Crypto Hippie just makes it so that nobody can tell who you are on the internet. So they can't associate your data with you and know everything about your life, which it's not only governments, it's also Google and Facebook. And no one's worse than Google. Google brings in $130 billion a year from quote-unquote free information that you give them. So Crypto Hippie, with a variety of special cryptography and other tricks, makes you anonymous on the internet, and we have surfing, email, chat, pretty much whatever you need for $200 a year.
Well worth the investment.
Yeah, I mean, if it didn't exist, I'd have to try to find something that was, I'd have to try to find some way to build it again.
Now, Paul, let's go back almost 10 years. You came on, one of the first guests that came on Operation Freedom, and you educated and empowered every person that listened that day and had an open ear, if you will, right, that the surveillance state, the deep state, was surveilling, monitoring phone calls, emails, internet activities, financial transactions, text messages. And Paul, there were, as I mentioned, a number of people felt that this was complete conspiracy theory. In fact, Paul, you were 9 3/4 years ahead of the curve from, if you will, even the bought-off lamestream fake media just even touching on it.
Yeah. Well, I was in the business, and I had to deal with these things every day. And now, well, now they admit it. As soon as everyone's nervous about this virus. We'll just track everybody on your cell phones. They didn't build that in 3 days. That was already there. Right. That was there the whole time, ever since smartphones came along. They're all tracked. You could build a smartphone that wasn't evil, but they don't. And all the model of money of Silicon Valley and all of this over the last 10 years or more is to just take people's information and steal it and use it in ways they wouldn't and pretend that it's free. And, I guess every once in a while, the world is just ready to fall for the oldest trick. Look, little girl, here, there's candy in the car. It's free. and everybody fell for it.
On March 19th, 2017, Paul, as you well know, General Tom McInerney, with the support of Admiral Ace Lyons, came on our radio show and spoke about the fact that it was not just NSA abuse that was occurring about this illegal surveillance, but in fact it was occurring on what are called parallel platforms outside of the NSA system that don't track through log records if some people are abusing it or criminally using it to, if you will, surveil, spy, get information for leverage purposes on other individuals. They came forward, as you know, on that date and spoke about a surveillance platform, an illegal surveillance platform that had been commandeered by Obama, Brennan, and Clapper called the Hammer. There were those that criticized anyone and everyone who spoke about that. I must say the people that criticized those that came forward, the people that did the criticism had no functional knowledge in surveillance platforms. Individuals that had expertise, such as Bill Benny and Kirk Wiebe, two of the foremost experts in surveillance platforms, actually confirmed the existence of the Hammer. And Paul, you got involved in that when you looked at the situation and, in fact, corroborated the fact that the government has a multitude of ways of surveilling people, including parallel platforms. Yet, anyone that spoke about parallel platforms were criticized as being conspiracy theorists and peddling fraud. Your take?
Well, they're misinformed, liars, or both. Of course, there are all these parallel ways of doing it. That's what intelligence is these days. It's not James Bond, skulking around on a street and finding a bad guy anymore. It's all about grabbing data and sorting data, and that's the game. That's what it is. So anybody who says otherwise is like I say, either ignorant or a liar or, a paid sycophant, which I think is probably most. But absolutely this is what's going on worldwide. It's not just the U.S., it's everybody. Anyone who can afford to do it is getting in on the act because it's easy and it's cheap, and it's the very first thing they do. It's the very first place they go to spy on anybody is the Internet. Because everything's out there, and they can just grab it. It's not a problem.
And then, in fact, Paul, that data that is obtained through these illegal parallel platforms is then used for control and leverage purposes.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, we know from the Snowden slides that they were training operatives on how to manipulate people on the Internet. I mean, you can see the slides. These particular ones came from GCHQ, which is the British NSA. And this is 10 years ago. They had slides on how you can, manipulate people on the Internet, and here's how, and training their operatives to do it. So there's not a question that this is true or not. It's just that it's such a big thing to bite off for most people who take comfort in whatever, that, the system really isn't out to get them. Of course, this would never happen to us, blah, blah, blah. They're comfortable with that. But, when you start saying it's actually happening, it's scary.
Let's discuss a system trying to take somebody out. Let's particularly discuss General Michael Flynn, who was targeted by the deep state. It all stems back to two phone calls he had on December 29, 2016, December 31st, 2016, that he had with the Russian ambassador as he was incoming national security advisor. It was alleged that he spoke about altering the sanctions that Obama had and his administration had put into place. And in fact, that's what he was accused of lying about when he said that he didn't remember speaking about sanctions. There were those phone calls were intercepted, Paul, and transcripts were made. And in fact, transcripts were recently released by the acting director of national intelligence, Richard Grenell. And sure as shooting, when the transcripts were released, Paul, it showed that General Flynn did not speak about altering sanctions. In fact, he didn't lie. But here's the point, Paul. And here's what the bought-off lamestream fake media refuses to touch. Richard Grenell, the acting director of national intelligence, he spoke about the transcripts. And here's what he said. The intelligence community, now intelligence community, Paul, would mean all 17 organizations that comprise the U.S. intelligence community, correct?
Well, the 17 ones that we know about and that are the major ones, we don't know how many other ones there are. We do know for sure of those 17.
So here's what he said. the intelligence community doesn't have all the transcripts or summary. Now listen, it wasn't our product. So Paul, Richard Grinnell just confirmed everything that General McInerney, Admiral Lyons, you, Bill Benny, Kirk Wiebe, Mary Fanning, Alan Jones, Dave Janda have said, because if it's not a product of the 17 intelligence communities, including the FBI, where supposedly this came out of, if it doesn't include that, the only option, Paul, is an illegal surveillance platform operating, if you will, on a separate platform.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. The whole thing is just a publicity game. They're just trying to get people upset about things and get the right people upset to put pressure the right way. I mean, look at it this way. Here's an incoming, a national security advisor. We don't want him to talk to the Russians or the Chinese. That's his job. Do we want security directors who don't talk to anybody else? I mean, that's a recipe for war. You want these guys talking to each other. That's their job.
Well, and in fact, when you read the transcripts from General Flynn's phone call, he is trying to calm the Russians down so there is not a military conflict. In fact, General Flynn in that phone call, of which they've made him into a political prisoner over, General Flynn prevented a military conflict.
Yeah, and that's the man's job. And all of this stuff is just to get people reacting emotionally and stupidly. When you make people afraid, when you make them emotional, when you make it us versus them and we're going to get our evil enemies, their IQ drops like a brick. They don't think.
And Paul, Plan A was this COVID, this coronavirus crisis, this lockdown. That was their means of instilling fear and control and try to create social unrest, the deep state. That failed. So we got now into Plan B. Plan B, and granted, what happened in Minneapolis shouldn't have happened in Minneapolis. That and people are being held to the rule of law on that. But then what occurred?
Right. There's no excuse. It was just plain out vicious murder. But that doesn't justify burning down stores.
No, and you know what? You and I are advocates for free speech, always have been. The First Amendment, the right of protest. It's what makes one of the things that makes our country great. Protesting is fine, but Paul, I have been demonized for saying that once you start getting into looting and rioting, that is not a protest. Those are criminal acts, and that is when law enforcement has to step in.
Well, there's no question that these are criminal acts, and to be honest, I think a whole lot of it just came from the fact that people have been under house arrest for 3 months. Most of us don't take very well to that. And all of a sudden, there's never been, Dave, you're a physician. You probably know better than me. Can you think of another historical example where there was some disease and the healthy were locked inside for 3 months?
No, that's not quarantine. Quarantine is isolating those that are infected. When you isolate people that are healthy, that's called house arrest, Paul.
Yep. And it's very, very bad for people. It makes them nuts.
And Paul, you and I both lived through the Chicago riots in 1968.
Yes.
Mayor Richard Daley was the mayor of Chicago. There was one in the spring, but there was even bigger riot, if you want to call it that. Bigger. They were both big, but in August of 1968, when the Democratic National Convention was in Chicago, the police were overrun. The National Guard was overrun. And it's my understanding Mayor Daley actually called, Johnson was president at the time, for possible support from active duty military personnel. Johnson did not provide that. We've seen the ravages of rioting and looting and arson. And Paul, I thought I would never see that again in my lifetime.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I didn't think it would happen again either.
But we saw it this past couple weeks.
Oh, it's been horrifying, heartbreaking, the whole thing. I mean, I was, and no normal person can watch what happened to George Floyd, and I don't care if he's a saint or a less than great human being, whatever. This man held his knee on his neck for almost 9 minutes. He knew he was dying. It was just evil. But, and if you want to complain about that, and look, there are plenty of complaints about cops. I have friends and family and myself when I was young who were abused by cops. There's a real problem here. But that doesn't mean you burn down stores and break windows and go in. There's no excuse for that.
There isn't any excuse for it. And in fact, Paul, one of the most heart-wrenching videos, in addition to the George Floyd video, was a video of a 38-year police veteran from St. Louis who is now retired, who was shot by a looter outside a pawn store as he was trying to defend the store for his friend, a gentleman by the name of David Dorn, black police officer, retired. He was gunned down in cold blood by a looter.
Yeah, just horrifying.
My big concern, I know I'm going to get in trouble for this next statement, is we saw tremendous outrage about the death of George Floyd, as was appropriate, very appropriate. But Paul, I saw very little attention, if any, by the bought-off lamestream fake media and people that were doing these protests about the death of another black male, former lieutenant in the St. Louis Police Department, David Dorn.
No, you're absolutely right. There wasn't. I mean, there was a little. There are thinking human beings on the planet, but the news and the politicians, what they want is people acting like a herd of farm animals, and they want to get them moving one way and then run the parade and use it for their own means. And the black man being killed by a rioter didn't fit what they want, and they want to keep the crowd moving in their direction. Now, that will sound to some people like I'm being crude, but it is true, and it's most of the people who count the people they're affecting in the millions. That's what goes on. They have to keep the crowd moving. That's what elections are about. That's what all these social movements are about, keeping people in a mass moving in one direction. And the gentleman being killed by a looter didn't really fit, and so it got quickly ignored.
My concern, Paul, we've heard all the Black Lives Matter. Okay, very good. Black Lives Matter. And in fact, I believe all Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately, I believe the bought-off lamestream fake media that some people still believe is the mainstream media don't believe that all Black Lives Matter. They believe some Black Lives Matter. Because if they truly believed all Black Lives mattered, then there would be a commensurate exposure of what happened to former police lieutenant commander David Dorn as they did with George Floyd.
Oh, absolutely. And what about all the people who die in ghettos in rough areas every single day? When do they care about them?
Well, and that's right, because the vast majority of blacks who die in our country from altercations die from altercations of not with police, but black on black murder and crime.
Right. And why does nobody ever consider, maybe making all these drugs illegal makes the dealers very rich, and maybe this isn't a good thing to do? Because you talk about creating all the worst incentives. It creates just a sea of bad incentives for everybody. I'm not a fan of drugs, but the war on drugs has been making monsters rich since 1971. This has not helped us.
Well, Paul, just last week in my old hometown of Chicago, I believe 89 people were shot. Just last weekend, 23 of whom died, the vast majority of which were black. None of those deaths occurred at the hands of a police officer.
Right.
But nobody,
Right.
but nobody in the quote mainstream media end quote is talking about that.
It doesn't fit the get the crowd moving thing that they want. They're not about telling us the truth. I mean, anyone who's an adult should understand that and does on some level. But it's not about telling us the truth. It's about getting people to move as a herd.